The crimson dawn of August 7, 1942, broke over the Solomon Islands like a promise of blood. Major General Alexander Vandegrift stood on the deck of the USS Macaulay, watching the emerald silhouette of Guadalcanal emerge from the morning mist behind him. 23,000 Marines prepared for what would become the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific theater. Though none yet understood they were about to write the turning point of the war, the island stretched before them like a sleeping giant, its volcanic ridges shrouded in jungle canopy that seemed to pulse with hidden menace. Intelligence reports had been sketchy at best. The Japanese were building an airfield, a strategic position that could strangle Allied supply lines across the South Pacific. What the reports hadn't conveyed was the sheer alien nature of the terrain that would soon swallow whole battalions in its steaming embrace. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller adjusted his field glasses, studying the beach where his 1st Battalion, 7th Marines would soon land. The surf crashed against black volcanic sand, and beyond it, the jungle wall rose like a green curtain hiding unknown horrors. "Boys," he muttered to his aide, "we're about to find out what hell looks like with palm trees." The naval bombardment began at 6:13 in the morning, a thunderous symphony that rolled across the water like the judgment of gods. Shells screamed overhead, disappearing into the jungle where they erupted in geysers of dirt and splintered trees. The sound was deafening, a constant drumbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Yet even as the guns roared, Vandegrift knew this was merely the prelude to a much longer and deadlier song. As the first wave of landing craft approached the beach, the Marines could see smoke rising from the jungle where the bombardment had found its mark. The Japanese, caught by surprise, had fled inland, leaving behind their half-constructed airfield and the skeletal remains of their coastal defenses. It seemed almost too easy, this initial landing, and seasoned veterans among the Marines felt the familiar chill of foreboding that preceded the worst battles. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a correspondent for the Pacific Marine magazine, scribbled notes as his landing craft ground against the sand. The Marines around him were young, most barely out of their teens, their faces painted with camouflage and determination. They jumped into the surf with weapons held high, rushing toward a jungle that would test every ounce of their courage and endurance in the months to come. The airfield lay just inland, a crude strip of crushed coral and dirt that the Japanese had named Lunga Field. The Marines quickly renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed. At Midway, it was here, on this seemingly insignificant patch of ground, that the fate of the Pacific War would be decided. The Japanese would call it Starvation Island, and before the battle was over, both sides would understand why. According to historical records from the National World War II Museum, the initial landing on Guadalcanal caught Japanese forces completely off guard, as they had not expected such a bold Allied offensive so early in the Pacific campaign. As the sun climbed higher, more Marines poured ashore, establishing a perimeter that would soon become a fortress. They dug foxholes in the coral hard ground, strung barbed wire through the jungle, and prepared for the counterattack they knew would come. The Japanese had controlled the Pacific for 8 months, sweeping across the ocean like a tsunami of steel and fire. Now, for the first time, American forces were taking the fight to them. The morning of August 20th, 1942, brought the scream of aircraft engines to Henderson Field as the 1st Marine Fighter Squadron, 223, touched down on the coral runway. Major John Smith, the squadron commander, climbed from his Grumman F-4F Wildcat and surveyed the primitive airstrip that would become the most fought-over piece of real estate in the Pacific. The Marines had christened their air operations Cactus Air Force after the island's code name, and these pilots would soon prove that American aviation could match the feared Japanese Zero fighters. The jungle pressed close around the airfield, its canopy alive with the calls of exotic birds and the rustle of unseen movement. Maintenance crews worked frantically to build revetments for the aircraft using sandbags, palm logs, and anything else they could find to protect their precious fighters from the nightly bombardments that had already begun. The Japanese held air superiority throughout most of the Pacific, But Henderson Field was about to change that equation forever. Captain Marion Carl, an ace pilot with ice blue eyes and nerves of steel, walked the perimeter of the field with his mechanic, inspecting the Wildcat that would carry him into aerial combat. The aircraft seemed almost primitive compared to the sleek Japanese fighters, with their superior speed and maneuverability. But Carl knew that American pilots had advantages of their own: better armor, better radios, and a grim determination, born of months of retreat and defeat. The first major test came at midday when radar operators detected a formation of Japanese Betty bombers approaching from the northwest. The klaxon sounded across Henderson Field, and within minutes, 14 Wildcats were clawing for altitude above the jungle canopy. The enemy formation was massive: 27 bombers escorted by 17 Zero fighters. More aircraft than the entire Cactus Air Force possessed. Major Smith led the intercept, his voice crackling over the radio as he coordinated the attack. Tally-ho, bandits at 12 o'clock high. All flights, attack the bombers, ignore the escorts. The Wildcats dove into the enemy formation like avenging angels, their 650 caliber machine guns blazing tracers across the tropical sky. The Japanese had expected easy prey, but instead they found American pilots who fought with a fury born of desperation and determination. Captain Carl latched onto a Betty bomber that had separated from the formation, its port engine trailing smoke from the initial attack. He closed to point-blank range, his guns hammering the enemy aircraft until it exploded in a ball of flame and debris. Around him, the sky filled with the deadly ballet of aerial combat, American and Japanese fighters twisting and turning in a three-dimensional chess game. Played at 300 miles per hour, the battle raged for 20 minutes before the surviving Japanese aircraft fled northward, leaving behind 5 bombers and 2 fighters smoking in the jungle below. The Americans had lost only 1 Wildcat. Its pilot safely recovered from the waters of Iron Bottom Sound. More importantly, they had proven that Henderson Field could defend itself, that the Cactus Air Force was more than just a symbolic presence. In the South Pacific, word of the victory spread quickly through the marine perimeter, carried by runners and radio operators to every foxhole and bunker. The soldiers, who had been digging in the coral and stringing barbed wire through the jungle, suddenly stood a little straighter, their faces brightening with the first real hope they had felt since landing on the island. The Japanese were not invincible after all. They could be fought, they could be beaten, and they could be sent running back to their bases in the north. That night, as the pilots of the Cactus Air Force cleaned their weapons and prepared for the next day's missions, they could hear the distant rumble of naval gunfire from Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese were bringing up their heavy ships, preparing for the kind of bombardment that could turn Henderson Field into a crater-filled wasteland. But the American pilots slept soundly, knowing that they had given their ground forces something precious, proof that the tide of war was beginning to turn. The night of September 12, 1942, descended upon Guadalcanal like a suffocating blanket, thick with humidity and the promise of violence. Colonel Merritt Edson stood atop the coral ridge that stretched south of Henderson Field, studying the jungle through his binoculars as darkness swallowed the green canopy. His raiders and paratroopers had been holding this position for 3 days, and intelligence reports suggested that tonight would bring the largest Japanese attack yet attempted on the airfield. The ridge itself was a natural fortress, a narrow spine of coral and rock that rose from the jungle floor like the backbone of some prehistoric beast. The Marines had dug in along its length, creating interlocking fields of fire that could sweep the approaches with devastating effect. But Edson knew that the Japanese would come in overwhelming numbers, and his 800 men would face odds of nearly 5 to 1 before the night was over. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Griffith, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, moved through the positions like a ghost, checking ammunition supplies and whispering encouragement to his men. The Raiders were elite troops, volunteers who had trained for months in the art of jungle warfare. But nothing could have prepared them for the nightmare that was about to unfold. The Japanese attacks had been increasing in intensity for weeks, probing the American defenses, testing for weaknesses. The Marines met them with everything they had: rifle fire, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. The Coral Ridge became a killing ground where men died by the hundreds, their bodies piling up in the approaches as wave after wave of Japanese infantry threw themselves against the American positions. Private First Class Mitchell Page, manning a machine gun position, fired belt after belt of ammunition into the charging enemy, his weapon glowing red-hot in the darkness. The battle raged for hours, with positions changing hands multiple times, as the Japanese managed to penetrate the Marine lines, only to be driven back by desperate counterattacks. Colonel Edson moved constantly through the chaos, appearing wherever the fighting was thickest, his presence inspiring his men to stand firm against impossible odds. "The only thing between the Japanese and Henderson Field is us," he shouted. Over the din of battle, "We hold or we die." At 3 in the morning, the Japanese launched their final assault, a massive human wave that seemed to cover the entire slope of the ridge. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the Marine line might break, that the enemy would sweep over the defenders and capture the airfield that had become the symbol of American resistance in the Pacific. But the Marines held their fire discipline and superior position, finally telling against the Japanese courage and determination. Historical accounts from the Library of Congress Veterans History Project describe the Battle of Bloody Ridge as one of the most savage infantry engagements of the Pacific War, with Marines fighting hand-to-hand combat in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. As dawn broke over the ridge, the true scope of the carnage became apparent. More than 600 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the slopes, their bodies testimony to the desperate nature of their assault. The Marines had lost 49 men killed and 149 wounded, but they had held the ridge and saved Henderson Field. The victory would echo across the Pacific, proving that American forces could stand against the best the Japanese Empire could offer. The moonless night of October 11th, 1942, brought death down from the northwest in the form of Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's heavy cruiser force, racing through the darkness toward Guadalcanal at 33 knots. The Japanese had perfected the art of nighttime naval warfare, and their nightly runs down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, had earned the nickname Tokyo Express from the weary Allied forces who endured their bombardments aboard the heavy cruiser Chikai. Admiral Mikawa studied the intelligence reports spread across his chart table. The Americans had been reinforcing their positions on Guadalcanal for weeks, and Henderson Field continued to operate. Despite constant Japanese air attacks, tonight's mission was simple in concept but deadly in execution. Steam in under cover of darkness, bombard the airfield into rubble, and withdraw before Allied aircraft could respond at dawn. The Japanese squadron consisted of 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers, their hulls painted in dark gray camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the night sky. Each ship carried hundreds of 14-inch and 8-inch shells, specially designed for maximum destruction against land targets. The plan was to arrive off Guadalcanal at 1 in the morning, conduct a 90-minute bombardment, and be beyond the range of Allied aircraft by sunrise. On Henderson Field, the pilots of the Cactus Air Force slept fitfully in their tents, exhausted from another day of aerial combat against overwhelming odds. The Japanese had been increasing their air attacks, sending wave after wave of bombers and fighters to try to knock out the airfield permanently. Major John Smith, now commanding all fighter operations, had managed to keep his squadrons operational through a combination of cannibalized parts and sheer determination. The first warning came from the Coast Watcher Network, Australian and New Zealand observers hidden throughout the Solomon Islands, who radioed intelligence about Japanese movements. Ships passing Bougainville, course southeast, estimated speed 30 knots, crackled the message from Coast Watcher Paul Mason. But the warning came too late. The Japanese were already within striking distance of their target at 1:30 in the morning. The night sky above Henderson Field erupted in a hell of exploding shells and tracer fire. The Japanese cruisers had opened fire from just 8 miles offshore, their guns elevated for maximum effect against the airfield installations. The bombardment was precise and devastating, each shell carefully aimed to destroy aircraft, fuel, dumps, and maintenance facilities. The Marines on the ground could only hunker down in their foxholes and endure the nightmare that rained down from the darkness. Major Smith watched in horror as his precious aircraft were destroyed one by one, their fuel tanks exploding in brilliant orange fireballs that illuminated the jungle. For miles around, the sound was indescribable, a constant thunder of explosions punctuated by the screech of incoming shells and the crash of collapsing buildings. For 90 minutes, the bombardment continued without pause, the Japanese cruisers methodically working over every square yard of the airfield. When it finally ended, Henderson Field looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and smoking, with twisted metal and burning debris scattered across its length. Of the 90 aircraft that had been operational the previous evening, only 42 remained in flyable condition. But the Japanese had made a crucial mistake. They had focused their attention on the airfield itself while ignoring the fuel dumps and maintenance facilities hidden in the jungle. As dawn broke over the devastated field, American ground crews emerged from their shelters and began the Herculean task of making their remaining aircraft operational. Within hours, the first patched-up Wildcats were taking off from the cratered runway, their pilots grimly determined to exact revenge for the night's devastation. The psychological impact of the Tokyo Express raids was enormous, but it cut both ways. While the Japanese had demonstrated their ability to strike at will, they had also shown the limits of their power. Henderson Field continued to operate. Its aircraft continued to fly, and the Marines continued to hold their ground. Each night that the Japanese returned, they found their task a little harder, their losses a little heavier, their victory a little more elusive. The pre-dawn hours of November 13th, 1942, found Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan aboard the light cruiser USS San Francisco, leading a hastily assembled task force through the treacherous waters of Iron Bottom Sound. Intelligence reports had confirmed that the Japanese were bringing down their heaviest ships, yet to fast battleships and a powerful escort force, intent on delivering the knockout blow to Henderson Field and the Marine garrison. The American force was desperately outnumbered and outgunned, consisting of only 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, against Admiral Hiroaki Abe's formidable squadron of the battleships Haie and Kirishima, the light cruiser Nagara, and 14 destroyers. But Callahan had no choice except to intercept. If the Japanese battleships reached their bombardment positions, they would reduce Henderson Field to rubble and make the Marine position untenable. Captain Casson Young, commanding the San Francisco, stood beside Admiral Callahan on the bridge as they approached the narrow waters between Savo Island and Guadalcanal. The night was pitch black, with no moon to illuminate the enemy ships that were surely lurking somewhere in the darkness ahead. The American vessels moved in single file, their radar operators straining to detect the first signs of the approaching Japanese force. At 1:48 in the morning, the radar screens aboard the American ships suddenly lit up with contacts bearing northwest. At 18,000 yards, the Japanese force was massive, their formation stretching across several miles of ocean as they approached their bombardment positions. Admiral Callahan keyed his radio, his voice calm despite the overwhelming odds his force faced. All ships, this is Admiral Callahan. We are engaging the enemy. Give them hell. The battle that followed was unlike anything seen in the Pacific War. A savage point-blank engagement fought in total darkness, with ships passing so close that sailors could see the faces of their enemies. The Japanese opened fire first, their heavy guns illuminating the night with brilliant flashes as 14-inch shells screamed toward the American formation. The battleship Haie, Admiral Abe's flagship, immediately targeted the San Francisco with devastating effect. The American ships responded with everything they had, their smaller guns firing as fast as the crews could load them. The destroyer USS Laffey, commanded by Lieutenant Commander William Hank, charged directly at the Japanese battle line, her 5-inch guns blazing as she closed a suicidal range. The little destroyer's courage was magnificent but futile. She was blown apart by the concentrated fire of multiple Japanese ships, taking most of her crew with her. In the chaos of the night battle, friend and fire became almost impossible to distinguish. Ships fired at muzzle flashes and shadows, often hitting their own vessels in the confusion. The heavy cruiser USS Atlanta took a full salvo from the San Francisco. Her bridge shattered and Admiral Norman Scott killed instantly. The Japanese fared no better, their own ships firing on each other as the battle dissolved into a melee of individual ship actions. The turning point came when the destroyer USS Monson, already heavily damaged and burning, managed to close within 3,000 yards of the battleship Hiei. Her guns, firing at point-blank range, punched hole after hole in the Japanese flagship's superstructure, knocking out her steering and fire control systems. The mighty battleship, pride of the Imperial Navy, found herself dead in the water and unable to continue the mission. Admiral Callahan died on the bridge of the San Francisco when a Japanese shell scored a direct hit on the cruiser's superstructure. His last words, transmitted over the radio, were a simple command: "We want the big ones. Get the big ones first." Captain Young, wounded but still functional, continued the fight until his ship was so badly damaged that she could barely stay afloat. According to records from the U.S. Navy History and Heritage Command, the naval battle of Guadalcanal was one of the most savage surface engagements in American naval history, with ships fighting at ranges so close that sailors could throw hand grenades at enemy vessels. As dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, the water was littered with the wreckage of both fleets. The Americans had lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with heavy damage to most of their surviving ships, but the Japanese had been forced to withdraw, their bombardment mission unfulfilled, and the battleship Hiei was left behind as a burning hulk that would be finished off by aircraft from Henderson Field. The Marines would hold their ground for another day, and the myth of Japanese invincibility had suffered another devastating blow. The morning of November 15, 1942, dawned clear and bright over Henderson Field, where the surviving aircraft of the Cactus Air Force prepared for what would become one of the most decisive air battles of the Pacific War. Major Joseph Foss, the leading Marine ace with 23 confirmed kills, climbed into his bullet-riddled F-4F Wildcat and checked his ammunition one final time. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were making their final push to reinforce their ground forces, and a massive convoy of 11 transports was approaching under heavy escort. The Japanese convoy, commanded by Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, represented the last major attempt to land reinforcements on Guadalcanal in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the American defenders. The transports carried 7,000 fresh troops, heavy artillery, and enough supplies to sustain a major offensive against the Marine perimeter. But first, they had to survive the gauntlet of American air attacks that would begin as soon as they came within range of Henderson Field. At 8:15 in the morning, the first wave of American aircraft took off from the patched and cratered runway, their engines straining as they clawed for altitude above the jungle canopy. The strike force consisted of every flyable aircraft on the island: Marine fighters, Navy dive bombers, and Army Air Force B-25 Mitchell bombers that had been staging through Henderson Field. For the past week, it was a combined arms assault that would test every lesson learned in months of aerial combat. The Japanese convoy stretched across 10 miles of ocean, the transports wallowing heavily in the swells, while their escorts, 8 destroyers and a light cruiser, maintained a protective screen around the vulnerable cargo ships. Admiral Tanaka knew that his ships were sailing into a hornet's nest, but he also knew that this was Japan's last chance to reinforce their garrison. Before the American buildup made the island impregnable, Major Foss led the first attack, his division of 4 Wildcats diving on the escort vessels to suppress their anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese responded with a wall of flak that turned the sky into a deadly maze of blackbursts and tracer streams. Foss's wingman, Lieutenant Bill Marentate, was hit in the first pass, his aircraft trailing smoke as he struggled to maintain control and line up for his attack on the lead transport. The dive bombers came next, their SPD Dauntlesses screaming down from 12,000 feet in near vertical dives that brought them within 500 feet of their targets before releasing their bombs. The lead transport, Kinugawa Maru, took 3 direct hits that left her burning and listing heavily to port. Around her, the other transports began evasive maneuvers, their captains throwing their unwieldy vessels into desperate turns as American bombs and torpedoes filled the water around them. The battle raged for hours as wave after wave of American aircraft attacked the convoy from every conceivable angle. The Japanese fought back with everything they had, their anti-aircraft gunners firing until their barrels glowed red-hot and their ammunition ran low. But the attacks were relentless, and one by one, the transports began to fall victim to the concentrated assault. By noon, 6 of the 11 transports had been sunk or were sinking, their cargoes of men and supplies settling to the bottom of the Solomon Sea. The surviving vessels, many of them heavily damaged, continued toward Guadalcanal under the protection of Admiral Tanaka's destroyers. But the Japanese commander knew that his mission was already a failure. Even if the remaining transports reached the island, they would carry only a fraction of the reinforcements needed to turn the tide of battle. The psychological impact of the convoy's destruction rippled through both forces like a shock wave. On Henderson Field, the pilots, who had flown multiple missions that day, collapsed in exhaustion, but their faces glowed with the satisfaction of a job well done. They had proven that American air power could stop even the most determined Japanese offensive, and that the tide of war in the Pacific was shifting inexorably in favor of the Allies. That evening, as the sun set over the Solomon Islands, the surviving Japanese transports limped into the waters off Guadalcanal and began frantically unloading their remaining cargo. But Admiral Tanaka knew that it was too little, too late. The American defenders had held their ground, their air forces had proven their superiority, and the Japanese dream of recapturing Henderson Field was dying in the tropical waters of Iron Bottom Sound. The morning of February 7, 1943, brought an unusual silence to the jungles of Guadalcanal as Marine patrols pushed deeper into the island's interior, searching for the last remnants of the Japanese garrison. Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, commanding the long-range patrol unit, stood on a ridge overlooking the Cocambona area where intelligence reports suggested the enemy had established their final defensive positions. But the jungle was quiet, almost eerily so, and the Marines found only abandoned equipment and hastily dug graves. The truth was almost impossible to believe. After 6 months of the most savage fighting in the Pacific War, the Japanese had quietly evacuated their remaining forces during the previous 3 nights. Operation, as the Japanese called their withdrawal, had been executed with the same precision and skill that had characterized their earlier offensives. Under cover of darkness, destroyers and submarines had spirited away the survivors of what had once been a garrison of 36,000 men. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, now commanding the 14th Corps, received the confirmation from his patrols with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The Battle of Guadalcanal was over, and the Americans had won their first major victory against the Japanese Empire. But the cost had been enormous, over 7,000 American casualties, including 1,600 killed in action, with thousands more evacuated due to disease and exhaustion. The impact of the victory extended far beyond the shores of a single island in the Solomon Sea. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt read the dispatches from the Pacific with growing satisfaction. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and American forces had proven they could take the offensive against the Empire's best troops. The victory at Guadalcanal had bought precious time for the American war machine to reach full production, and the tide of war was about to turn decisively. Word of the victory spread throughout the Pacific theater like wildfire, reaching Allied forces from Australia to Alaska. On the Bataan Peninsula, where American and Filipino prisoners still languished in Japanese camps, the news was whispered from cell to cell. Despite the brutal punishment that awaited anyone caught spreading such propaganda, the victory gave hope to men who had almost forgotten what hope felt like. In Australia, General Douglas MacArthur received the news at his headquarters in Brisbane and immediately began planning the next phase of the Pacific offensive. The victory at Guadalcanal had secured his right flank and provided the springboard for the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific to the very shores of Japan. The long road to Tokyo had begun with the defense of a single airfield on a jungle island that most Americans had never heard of. The pilots of the Cactus Air Force, now dispersed to new assignments throughout the Pacific, carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of the most decisive battles in American military history. Major Joseph Foss, with 26 confirmed kills, would become the Marine Corps' first ace of the war. His example inspired a new generation of pilots who would carry the fight to the Japanese homeland. According to post-war analysis by military historians, the Battle of Guadalcanal marked the first time in the Pacific War that American forces had successfully executed a combined arms operation against determined Japanese resistance, proving that the Allies could fight and win on ground of their own choosing. The strategic implications of the victory were immediately apparent to military leaders on both sides. The Japanese had lost their last opportunity to expand their defensive perimeter, and from February 1943 onward, they would be fighting a defensive war against increasingly superior Allied forces. The initiative had passed to the Americans, never to return to Japanese hands. As the last Marines departed Guadalcanal for new assignments throughout the Pacific, they carried with them more than just their weapons and equipment. They carried the knowledge that they had participated in the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when the tide of battle shifted decisively in favor of the Allied cause. The victory at Guadalcanal had not only saved Australia and New Zealand from the threat of Japanese invasion, it had opened the road to Tokyo itself. The island they left behind was transformed, its jungle cleared for new airfields and supply depots that would support the advancing Allied forces. Henderson Field, once a crude strip of crushed coral defended by a handful of Marines, had become a major air base from which American bombers would range across the Pacific. The sacrifice of the men who had held that field had not been in vain. It had purchased victory in the Pacific War and secured the future of freedom in the region. The spirit of Guadalcanal would live on in every subsequent Pacific battle, inspiring Allied forces from the Marshall Islands to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. The Marines who had held Bloody Ridge, the pilots who had flown with the Cactus Air Force, and the sailors who had fought in Iron Bottom Sound, had proven that American forces could stand against the best the Japanese Empire could offer. Their victory had given hope to a world at war and pointed the way toward final victory in the Pacific.